Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Dr. C. Bradley Thompson, Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for a conversation on crony capitalism and the American Constitution with Dr. Michael Munger from Duke University. My name's Michael Hoffpauir. I'm Associate Director of the Lyceum Program and Clinical Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science here at Clemson University. The Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism and its Lyceum Program are dedicated to the study of the moral, political, and economic foundations of a free society. The Lyceum Program is a great books program that offers a scholarship to incoming students and a minor to current students of Clemson University. Its curriculum ranges from classical to modern political philosophy to the American founding and the political theory of capitalism. If you know a high school senior who would excel in our program, please encourage that student to apply today. You can learn more by visiting our website at clemson.edu/Lyceum. Now, tonight's talk is part of our Lyceum Lectures, which have been made possible with generous support from the Jack Miller Center. We thank the Jack Miller Center for helping us have conversations like this one that are centered around the principles and institutions that make a free way of life possible. Before we begin, I'd like to talk about the format of tonight's conversation. Our guest, Dr. Michael Munger, and I will talk a bit before we open things up to a Q&A from the audience. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the talk by typing them into the chat box. Our hope is to have this be a conversation not only between Dr. Munger and me, but between Dr. Munger and you. Now, to get to our guest. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Munger. Dr. Munger is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at Duke University. His primary research focus is on the functioning of markets, regulation, and government institutions. Dr. Munger has taught at Dartmouth College, University of Texas, and University of North Carolina. And he also worked as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission during the Reagan administration. He is a senior fellow of the Independent Institute and the American Institute for Economic Research, and is former president of the Public Choice Society. Dr. Munger was North American editor of Public Choice for 5 years and is now a co-editor of the Independent Review. His most recent books include Is Capitalism Sustainable? And Tomorrow 3.0, Transaction Costs and the Sharing Economy. Dr. Munger holds an MA and PhD in economics from Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Munger.
There we are.
Dr. Munger, it is great to see you. And it's also great to see something in the background there, right behind you. It seems as if you have a unicorn lurking over your shoulder.
I have a unicorn.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's really kind of up to you. You may notice that I also have a unicorn here in my coffee cup. So it is a sort of theme of my professional work.
Would you mind talking to us a little bit about it?
I almost can't be stopped, as you might guess. So I have long been worried about the problem of ideal theory in philosophy. And it is true that ideal theory is an interesting question in the sense that the ability of human beings to imagine a society better than the one that they now live in is one of the driving forces of progress. However, I have noticed that the criticism of markets and the sort of institutions that drive what Adam Smith described as man's innate propensity to truck, barter, and exchange tend to use ideal theory in a strange way. So they look at markets as they are, and then they compare that to the state that they can imagine. Unsurprisingly, the state that they can imagine performs pretty well. So I did a video where I proposed that unicorns should be used for public transportation. That they, after all they eat is rainbows, and they have no emissions, and they can pull a very heavy wagon, and that would be better than our current mass transit system. Now, you might object, plausibly, well, wait, that won't work. Unicorns don't exist. Ah, but they do. If you close your eyes and I close my eyes and the 80 members of the audience close their eyes and you think of a unicorn, what do you see? You don't see nothing. You see a unicorn. And the one that I see is white. It has an orange horn and it's surrounded by rainbows. Perhaps it's lunchtime. So unicorns obviously exist. The problem is they exist only in people's minds. And so when we have a political ideology that is based on the critique of actual institutions, we say we will substitute the markets that we see for the state that we can imagine. And then when it doesn't work out, we say, what we need is better people. All we need is a better elected official. We'll have reform because this is not what I was imagining. My proposal, and the reason that I'm so fascinated by unicorns, is the claim that what we need to do is compare markets as they are and the state as it is. So I propose what I've called the Munger test. Immodestly, forgive me. But the Munger test is if you say the state should do something. I have many colleagues at Duke, as you might imagine, that would say, oh, the state should be in charge of this. I say, okay, fine. But when you say that, take out the word state and put in Donald Trump. Do you still believe it? Because there's no such thing as the state. The state is an institution that is peopled and animated by human beings. And human beings may have very different properties than the unicorns that you can imagine. So if you still believe Donald Trump should be in charge of deciding what reproductive rights should be and whether the United States should bomb Iran, knock yourself out. But most of them don't believe that. They actually believe that the unicorn that they call the state should be in charge. So that was a pretty long answer, but you did ask. And that's why there's a unicorn in the background. Sometimes I wear it. It is, after all, a fake head.
I wasn't gonna bring that up.
Because you were afraid I would do it. That's plausible.
Yeah, well, it was just Halloween.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. No, that's very helpful. And I think it also helps us get on your wavelength from the jump of what you want us now to understand about crony capitalism. But I'd like to start a little bit differently here and begin with a question from the audience, which was submitted early, one of our favorite types of questions. A person named Steven sent in a question for you, and it's great to start right there. He says, why do you call it crony capitalism? Cronyism is state intervention in the economy, government subsidies, tariffs, special tax breaks, etc. Capitalism is the socio-economic system that separates the state from the economy. So Stephen then asks, it seems correlating cronyism with capitalism prefers the concept of capitalism, and therefore shouldn't you be calling it crony statism?
Well, as you know, my book is entitled, Is Capitalism Sustainable? And the short answer is no. So I also have an article that was entitled The Road to Crony Capitalism. And that's the answer to Stephen's question. So that harks back to Hayek's famous 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom. And the caricature of the road to serfdom is that if we manage one single price anywhere in the economy, that immediately leads to a slippery slope towards socialism. Well, no, that's not what Hayek said. What he said was that there was a tendency within government management of the economy to increase the amount of power that bureaucrats have over prices and the allocation of resources. Now, that tendency can be stopped, and in fact, it can be turned around. We saw in the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that there are turnarounds on the road to serfdom. What I'm writing about in The Road to Crony Capitalism is that there is an inherent tendency within capitalism to seek more profits, and profits are the accounting excess of revenues over costs. Now, Stephen rightly says that there is a moral component to this, and that is capitalists should avoid using the state to increase their profits. And I would ask, why would you believe that? That's a unicorn, Stephen. If I am a capitalist and I have stockholders, and I have two choices. So I'm a manager and I have stockholders. I have two choices. I can undertake a legal but immoral program of lobbying that will secure for my company subsidies and protections from competition. Or I can eschew that and just try to pursue honest profits by making better products and make them cheaper. Now, if I do the second, I will be fired because there's a competitive market for managers. And my stockholders will demand that one of the many managers who are willing to undertake this legal but admittedly immoral program of lobbying and subsidy that will increase their stock price. Now, suppose that we have an unusual group of stockholders, and those stockholders say, you know, we actually agree with the manager. We think that it is immoral to pursue subsidies. Well, that means that if I am a specialist in mergers and acquisitions, I can go to a bank and I can say, what I would like to do is borrow money and buy these stocks because this company is underperforming. Its stock price would be higher if they would undertake the legal but immoral program of pursuing subsidies and lobbying. And when I offer those stockholders a premium of 20% over the existing stock price, even if they're pretty moral, they'll say, I'm going to take that premium. So I buy the company, I fire the management, I hire new management who will engage in lobbying. So the point is, Stephen, within the logic of capitalism, capitalism is not sustainable. There is a contradiction in capitalism within a democracy, and you hiding behind, oh, that statism is exactly the problem. Look at this. My friends here at Duke, when I say, you know, Venezuela proves that socialism doesn't work, they say, oh, well, that's not socialism. But that's where socialism leads, because socialism gives power to the state over the allocation of resources. Well, now my friends on the left could, with equal justification, say, look, they're all these big corporations. They're just bought and paid for, and many of their profits depend on subsidies from the state. And I say, oh, that's not capitalism. Yes, but it's where capitalism leads in a democracy. And you playing word games doesn't defend us from the fact that there is an inherent tendency in capitalism, within a democracy, I admit, towards cronyism. We have to accept that that criticism of the left is correct and dangerous, and not hide behind word games.
There's so much there in what you've just offered us. I really appreciate it. And I want to kind of slow down a little bit in light of this comprehensive view you've given us of your thesis. Foremost, can you help me understand, not as a CEO or a shareholder, but just as a person who consumes coffee and gasoline on a regular basis and so on and so forth, not in the same cup, but in the same, how is it that I would encounter crony capitalism in my daily life?
Well, I think the definition that Stephen gave, having criticized the question, now let me say it's a very useful question, and I think the definition that it has is correct. So let me build up from first principles. Markets are a system that allocate resources according to their opportunity cost, and our measure of opportunity cost is prices that are formed in competitive conditions. So in competitive conditions, markets generate prices which give us information about the opportunity cost of resources. Mm-hmm. And those are accurate in the sense that they cause us to take into account the needs of other people. So one of the problems with things like price gouging laws is that I go into a store and the price is held artificially low and I think I'll fill up my cart. Whereas if the price were allowed to rise, I would say, you know, other people besides me need this. So high prices and markets cause us to take into moral account the needs of others. That's one of the great advantages of markets. We have a moral concern for others because we get the signal that prices tell us, leave some for the person behind you. They need it too. And I don't even know who they are. I just know I'm going to leave some for the person behind me. So it's a brilliant system. Now, capitalism is layered on top of that. Capitalism is a system that generates liquidity for the pursuit of profitable ideas. Now, in a true capitalist system, the pursuit of profitable ideas is conditioned and limited by the fact that some profitable ideas are also risky and I may be subject to loss. So if I win, I get the win. If I lose, I get the loss. And so capitalism is a way of generating liquidity. And so when people ask me, what's the argument for capitalism? The argument is really one word. It is liquidity. So people can put together a mass of capital and then use it to pursue a profitable idea. And the reason why a profitable idea is good for society is that it is generating consumer surplus. What most people don't recognize is the argument for capitalism is not profits. The argument for capitalism is consumer surplus, the benefits that are created to consumers. The only way I can make honest profits is to create enormous benefits for consumers. Now, the difficulty is that in a capitalist system, there are definitions of property rights, there are courts for the adjudication of disputes, and we also have a system of democracy where majority rule makes some decisions. So if we have a constitution that limits the stuff that the state can give away, capitalism might survive. The question is, can those limits survive majorities, or will majorities constantly peck away at them? Because the consumer is also a voter. And what I want as a consumer is lower prices. And if I can secure that by using politics, I may very well try to do it. So markets is a system of allocation. Capitalism is a system of generating liquidity for the pursuit of profitable ideas. Democracy is a parallel system for reconciling the conflicting plans and purposes of people in politics. And there's a conflict. And the problem is that power in politics metastasizes into power in markets. And there's no way that markets can avoid it because it really is more profitable for me to use the state. At some point, I stop hiring engineers and I start hiring lawyers because it's more profitable. Well, yes, but now I'm no longer producing consumer surplus. It looks the same. You ask the man on the street, how can he tell? I can't tell, except that all of a sudden I am no longer getting consumer surplus. Instead of selling things to consumers, producers go to Congress and sell it to them, and they get tax dollars as subsidies. So their revenues are coming from the state and not from consumers. But the consumer can't really tell. They just know this system is not working very well. I'm not getting consumer surplus from this. And the interesting thing is they then blame greed and markets, when in fact it's the state that's to blame.
So you've now spoken of prices there. Help me think about this, think about the effect that crony capitalism has not only on prices, but on the quality of goods, and in particular on innovation, because it would seem that it stifles it all.
The two main problems with cronyism are that the management of prices, usually in the form of price floors, or in the form of tariff barriers that prevent competition from abroad, mean that prices are going to be much higher than they would be if they reflected the actual, just the opportunity cost of the resources. And the second thing is that subsidies are a way of buying back those low prices, but it comes from taxpayers and not from increased cost savings. So I have been watching with some interest the increase in the stock price of a company you may have heard of called Tesla. So Tesla is now worth more than General Motors. Tesla is not a profitable company. How can it be that Tesla's stock price has gone up so much? And the answer is, if you look at the amount of subsidies, money taken at gunpoint from taxpayers and then given to people who buy Teslas, and these are not poor people. These are wealthy people who are buying the Teslas. So from the consumer's perspective, it looks as if I'm getting a break because I get to buy a Tesla at a low price. But Tesla is only profitable because of subsidies.
Well, so then it seems clear now how CEOs might perceive crony capitalism as beneficial, good, in their self-interest. But how does a politician or a bureaucrat view crony capitalism as in their interest? And let me be specific here. What about crony capitalism is attractive to the politician who is responsible not to shareholders, but to a constituency? Do they behave the same as shareholders? And what about crony capitalism is attractive to the unelected, faceless bureaucrats?
Well, remember, it's attractive compared to capitalism.
Mm.
It's not attractive compared to actual socialism, where they could arrange and claim credit for everything. So they don't get everything they want. So the difficulty is, remember that I come from the public choice branch of economics and political science. And the usual approach that public choice takes is, let's assume that voters are not geniuses and that politicians are not saints. Politicians are basically like the rest of us. They're no better, no worse, and they're trying to optimize. They're trying to do their best for themselves. Now, if I'm a politician and some capitalist creates a new product that benefits consumers a lot, and that capitalist makes a lot of money, and these are all voluntary contracts, all my workers get paid, all the consumers are better off, do I as a politician benefit from that? No, not at all. So what I say is, I'd like a piece of that action. And so there's actually an example of this that I often mention. I have a friend, probably well known in Clemson, John Allison, who was the CEO of BB&T, the bank in Charlotte. And during the 2007-2008 collapse of financial markets, his bank, BB&T, had largely divested itself of mortgage-backed securities because he thought they were too risky. So then in 2009, when the Toxic Asset Relief Program was implemented, he got a visit from an official from the Treasury Department who said, President Allison, we would really appreciate it if your bank would accept some of these TARP funds. So this is a guy comes in and says, we want to give you taxpayer money. And John Allison said, that's ridiculous. We have no need of taxpayer money. We have no exposure to these assets. We're in great shape. And the Treasury official looked around, and I'm sorry, I don't do a very good Italian accent, but you can see where I'm going with this. Treasury official looks around and says, it's a nice bank you've got here. It would be like a shame with something to happen, you know, a fire, an audit, these things happen, who knows how? So John Allison came to understand that if he did not accept TARP funds, the bank was going to be audited and subject to differential regulation, because they needed to tell the story that it was a defect in the capitalist system itself, and only the state could rescue the system from these greedy, short-sighted financial people. So BB&T ended up accepting money from the Toxic Asset Relief Program, even though they had absolutely no need to do so. So notice that, and here's the thing I think that's interesting, Michael. The things that you and I think are costs are benefits to politicians. It sounds like if you pay out money, that's a cost. And in a rational system, in a capitalist system, it is. But in a political system, paying out money is a benefit because it's not your money and you get to claim credit for doing it. So the real driving force here is the fact that even if the system of capitalists were able to resist, and I think they're not because it's within the logic of profit seeking, but even if they were, in a democratic system, politicians and bureaucrats, like this Treasury official, find it to their advantage to be able to entangle the capitalists and get control over them.
That TARP story. So let me be clear about something here then. So your thesis, to be clear, is that the effectual truth of capitalism in a democratic society is that it strongly tends towards cronyism. And any denial of this would be utopian. Utopian because for it to be otherwise, entrepreneurs and investors would have to act irrationally against their self-interest, their short-term self-interest, in favor of the common good. Therefore, what about democratic societies, and if I may, human beings, makes crony capitalism very so likely, or so very likely?
Well, I thought you were going to say the V word. You are, after all, trained in political theory at Claremont. And so the V word is something you say every morning when you get up. And the V word is virtue. And so virtue is a really important concept everywhere except public choice economics. So what public choice people usually say is, oh, we should not assume that politicians are good. And many economists would say the advantage of capitalism is that it doesn't assume that anyone is good. We're going to have to go back and rewrite all that, because in fact, virtue, just like Aquinas thought, just like Aristotle thought. So for 3,000 years, we have recognized that having people with a set of moral precepts that are founded in the practice of reason and right action are a way around this. So it is not inevitable that any system becomes cronyist. We could have more capitalists like John Allison. We could have more politicians like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But most important, we could have more voters like Stephen. We could have more voters who actually recognize that this is an immoral activity. So let me come first full circle and say what we need is better voters. One of the reasons that I think there is hope, and there are two reasons, but one of the reasons I think that there's hope is that if voters say, no, this is not something that I want. I do not want subsidies because I recognize, not just in the long run, but the medium run, this hurts the whole system. We should be able to resist. But as I see it, I ran for governor in 2008. I was shocked by how often I ran as a libertarian. I was shocked by how often, after I explained why it was that a system that was left to its own devices was likely to perform better, the voter would say, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But tell me, if you were governor, what would you do for me? That's the point. I wouldn't do anything to you. I would leave you on your own to pursue your own plans and purposes with liberty. But many people, that's not what they want. They want to know, what is the state going to give to them? As long as that is the mindset of voters, we have an uphill slog.
Right. So then we are talking about the challenge of self-government among a free people. It seems.
And self-government starts with governing myself. I have to not buy those products.
Yeah. So, and we know that this was a challenge, to say the least, which the founders of this country were very aware of. I would suggest the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, and the Constitution themselves are institutional, and if I could say it this way, even pedagogical responses to the problem of self-government. So I now must ask you, given the insufficiency of public choice theory in this model, are the Declaration, Federalist Papers, and Constitution themselves sufficient or insufficient for these purposes in your estimation?
Well, I'm not claiming public choice theory is insufficient. What I'm saying is that public choice theory is an accurate picture of what happens if you try to have institutions where people are not motivated by virtue and they're only motivated by self-interest.
I see.
So it is not a prescriptive model, it is a descriptive model. Now, to the extent that it has become more, not less, descriptive in the last 50 years, that's a problem of the society. That means that, and here I would want to give credit to the Jack Miller Center, that means that we have gotten away from the message of the founding and the very clear sensibility of the founders that we needed to have virtue go hand in hand with good institutions. So we need good institutions, that's perfectly right. And in Federalist 10, Federalist 51, many of the Federalist Papers, we see that they wanted to design institutions that would perform well, even if a politician were bad. But assuming that politicians are always bad is a mistake. We would like to have good politicians.
Thank you. So we have a question now. I'm going to turn to the audience questions. We have a question from Aaron. Aaron says, I hope that your presentation will shed light on the growing income and wealth inequality in the US. My comment is not in the form of, well, now I know, my comment is not in the form of a question because I'm making this comment at the start of your presentation. Please, I'm no good at this. So let me ask it this way. Is the growing income and wealth inequality in the US due to crony capitalism?
Yes, yes, it is. And the reason is that in a competitive system, it is very difficult to sustain great concentrations of wealth, because if a particular activity is profitable, other groups will come in. How will they do it? It's because capitalism directs liquidity like a fire hose towards the activity that most consumers want. But if you have a set of restrictions that make it more and more difficult for capitalism to direct liquidity in that way, you'll see enormous concentrations of wealth. And that concentration, so it happened fairly recently, that the wealthiest zip codes in the United States now all surround Washington, D.C.
Right.
Not New York, not San Francisco, not places where they make things, but places where they take things. So absolutely, growing wealth inequality is in large part due to the increase in crony capitalism. That's right.
Well, and it seems as if we still have audience members who want a few clear definitions offered, if you don't mind, Dr. Munger. Could you just, for the audience, please define crony capitalism? I see it popped up repeatedly throughout your conversation.
Crony capitalism is a system where prices and profits are largely managed by legislation and bureaucrats.
I hope that's satisfactory for the audience.
Well, it may not be. I wrote a book.
Well, yeah, and the article is also easy to find as well.
But it may be unsurprising that in a question and answer format, we didn't start with a series of definitions.
Well, your answer to Stephen's question, I think, was attempted so. But Luca asks a question. The framers of the Constitution prevented government from obtaining absolute power, in part through the separation of powers. Each branch of government is allowed within institutional limits to seek greater power. In turn, each protects against outside encroachment, subsequently preventing the concentration of power. Is there a similar institutional solution to the rent-seeking tendencies of corporations? In other words, a system which would allow for the inherent corporate tendency towards cronyism without cronyism actualizing.
Absolutely. And I think, to be fair, we pretty much had it. And we did have it up through the Supreme Court decision that we refer to now as Lochner. Lochner was correctly decided. So once Lochner was overturned, we were on the highway to hell. So it's not just that there is a conjectural constitution that would do what was just suggested. The original Constitution did a pretty good job, not just of separation of powers, but separating the state from the ability to interfere in the right to contract. And so a number of the members of the Supreme Court who wrote for the majority in Lochner correctly said that freedom of contract is just as important and should be just as immune to government interference as the freedoms that are mentioned in the First Amendment. So if that application, if Judge Fields and others, if that application of the 14th Amendment to the rights, privileges, and immunities to have protection of contract would have been sustained, I think we would be okay. However, that's unrealistic because a majority of citizens don't want that. In a democracy, the Supreme Court cannot stand forever against the will of majorities. And so what failed was our education system. Our education system failed to teach young people that the freedom of contract is every bit as important as the freedom of speech.
Joseph asks our next question. If democracy inevitably tends to lead to crony capitalism, and I certainly agree it does, Joseph adds, is there another political system that is less likely to devolve in that way?
Sure. And it's called dictatorship. And there are problems with dictatorship. So people often raise the example of Singapore, because Singapore is a very free state. It has relatively little cronyism. The problem is that I have to mention Argentina, Zimbabwe. There's a bunch of other dictatorships where it didn't go as well. So this is Plato's old problem. If I get to pick the dictator and the dictator is selected out of an elite that has been raised since birth to have the kind of noble lie that we can impose a better society, and we have an obligation to have a better society, and here are the precepts that it has to follow, that might work. But in a democracy, and to be clear, I'm kidding, I very much favor democracy. The two solutions, and I said there were two, one is better voters, and that one seems hard, although I do try to give a lot of talks about this. But another one is a dynamic system that has new industries. Because a new industry, usually those companies for a decade or more invest only in honest profits. So Microsoft, famously, for 15 years, 20 years, didn't have any lobbyists. Now they have an entire building on K Street. So new young industries always are going to focus on real capitalism. And the American system is dynamic enough that we're more than surviving. We're doing okay. But these industries, as they mature and grow older, turn towards the state. And the exception, there is an exception where from the beginning, it turned towards the state, and that is so-called green energy. Now, I'm a fan of green energy. I like renewable energy. I would be happy to buy a Tesla if the price were honestly cheap enough. But I would never buy a Tesla because it is being bought down by the blood, sweat, and tears of poor people who are being forced to pay taxes so that wealthy people can drive a cool car and brag about how they're saving energy.
Henry's question then is right on time. From the audience, Henry asks, does not crony capitalism or corporatism also lead to inequality due to its negative impact on innovation? Right in line with what you just said.
Yes. And so a big problem with, because innovation's hard and it's risky. So Apple, we talk about the fact Apple for a long time had a lot of innovation. Well, they had several products that were just stupid, and they lost $1 billion in the case of several of the things that Apple, but since it was a private company, those losses were absorbed. So there's always going to be a lot of losses in the private sector, but innovation you get to keep. Companies are going to try to play with house money. That is, if they make losses, they would like to have those losses subsidized. The price is going to be that the state and its regulation and restrictions on entry will stifle innovation in just the way that was said. And so it's always so hard to know what is the cost of a product we never see. It's like Bastiat seen and unseen. So what does it cost me for the fact that this product, this drug, this medical device was never invented? Well, I have no idea. But I do know that when you add those things up, it's a catastrophe.
So Jonathan then asks, should we just keep government and corporations apart in our economy? Is it as simple as that, and is that the solution?
Look, a unicorn. Who is this we, Jonathan? Most people want it. So there's no we here. There's like 7 of us, and I'm one. I'll admit, I'm with you. So we could start a movement and we could go march in Washington and we could all fit in a phone booth. So there is no support for that. Yes, it is true that if we were to reinstate freedom of contract, so go back to Lochner and say, and this is Richard Epstein, the famous political economist and lawyer at the University of Chicago and New York University. His claim is, his book, The Libertarian Constitution, says that we need to go back and recognize that Lochner was correctly decided. But there's no support for that on the Supreme Court, and there's no support for that in the public. So this we that you're talking about, I hear that a lot in libertarian meetings. You know, this is what we should do. There's no we. So you're right in every unimportant sense.
So this will be the last question then, and I'd like to return to the title of your article, The Road to Crony Capitalism, which is of course a nod to Hayek. You mean to say crony capitalism is not inevitable? We're on the road. Although we're on the road, we've yet to arrive. We can still turn around or get off this road. And I want to ask a question that's a little more conceited. Can political science or economics, can the social sciences help us get off this road?
I am a student of Douglass North, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1993, but he was famously mocked by economists because he thought that rules and ideologies and moral codes were in many ways more important than prices for explaining the great changes in history. And Douglass North always would ask what seemed like a paradoxical question. So rules and norms, institutions almost never change until they do. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how can we have a theory that both explains the fact that most of the time things kind of just motor along fairly smoothly. We're going in the same direction. And sometimes we see great changes. And so I would come back to a charismatic politician who is capable of explaining the reasons why a free society of responsible individuals, and the responsible individuals is an important part. This is just not we're all free to do whatever we want. Montesquieu famously said that the reason that liberty is important is so that we can do what we ought to will. The reason for liberty is so we can do what we ought to will. So we are given liberty, but then we have certain responsibilities as citizens to use it responsibly. So the North's claim is that it's very difficult to change institutions, but it's not impossible. So we saw Ronald Reagan, we saw Margaret Thatcher, we saw great movements that in some ways reversed and in some ways uncoupled some of the regulatory chains that held back US industry. In the 1970s, the United States, we had a really terrible times in terms of growth of industry. But then under the Carter administration, there was a move towards deregulation. The Carter administration, a Democratic administration, they deregulated the financial industry, they deregulated the airline industry, they deregulated trucking. So there was a recognition that the cronyism had proceeded to such an extent that there was a kind of institutional sclerosis. It was as if barnacles had built up on the bottom. If we can clean it off, everyone can be better off. So if you think in terms of a theory of crises, we may be okay if things get bad enough, but that's a really risky thing to do. But if things get bad enough, then a charismatic politician like Ronald Reagan may be able to come along and explain things and say, I can lead you back at least in the direction of the founding. I can lead you back in the direction of the constitutional precepts that have served this country so well for so long.
Well, I think that is an excellent place to end. I apologize to our audience who offered us some questions that we didn't have time to get to, but nonetheless, we thank you all for attending. Dr. Michael Munger, thank you very much for taking some time with us. It was great to speak with you. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you all sometime soon. Good evening.